Hi there, welcome to my channel. This is where we look at the weird and wonderful animals that we have in our aquariums. From bizarre-looking fish to strange inverts. I hope you enjoy this. So today we're going to be looking at one of my favorite crabs, the toxic reef crab. This crab has been in my aquarium for nearly 3 years now, and he is one of my favorite inhabitants. He's not the most colorful, he's not the biggest, but he is certainly the most interesting in my opinion. So let's get into the bio. The first thing that I think people notice about this crab is its size. They can get pretty big, especially compared to other crabs that we commonly see in the hobby. These guys are part of the family that all have these big and they can grow up to 4 inches, so around 10 centimeters across, which is really big. But also they have an enormous shell. They have this kind of shield-like shell that covers their entire back, and it can get pretty big as well. My guy here measures around 6 inches or 15 centimeters from the tip of his shell to the end of his tail. So yeah, he's pretty big. Now he's very healthy and active. He's got lots of appetite and a good metabolism because he's always hungry. The other thing that you will notice about these guys is that they're not just big, they're also armed with some huge claws. Now, these things aren't just for show. In fact, if you try and pick them up with your bare hands, you will know exactly how strong these things are. They can easily crush a shrimp in their pincers, and they've even been known to break aquarium glass. So, what do they look like? Well, they come in a variety of different colors, but they all have some common features. First of all, they have a spiky shell, so you won't mistake them for a hermit crab or something like that. It's hard and kind of crunchy feeling, and the edge of the shell forms this kind of wall around the sides of their body. Then they have 2 big claws. One is bigger than the other, but they're both pretty massive, and then the rest of their body looks quite human-like, if you know what I mean. They have a little segmented body with these little stumpy legs and a tail, but actually when you look at those legs, they're totally different from most crabs. They're kinda short and stubby, and they don't really look like swimmerets or anything like that. And they have 2 little claws at the end of those legs. Kinda like little hammers. They also have a sort of narrow waist between their shell and their abdomen. You can kinda see it if you look from above. So it's not like the broad, flat shell of like a box crab or something like that. So they're quite distinctive. They are very solitary animals. So keep them in groups. I would say minimum 20 gallons or 75 liters, something like that. So they need a fair-sized tank and then add a lot of rock work. And I would also recommend having sand as well because they like to burrow. You'll find them kind of hiding away in their little burrows during the day. And sometimes I've seen mine. He kind of comes out, hides under a rock, kind of peeks out. So lots of rock work and sand. And then make sure you feed them plenty, because they can be quite greedy, okay? So we've talked about their appearance and we've talked about their general size, but what about their lifespan? Well, it varies depending on species, but in general, these crabs can live for 10 to 15 years. So yeah, they are a long-term commitment. Now these guys are native to the tropical waters of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. They refound all the way from East Africa to the islands of Oceania and also north to the Ryukyu Islands, south to northern Australia, and west to the Arabian Sea. They're also known to migrate, so they move around. They can travel many kilometers each year following the currents and tides. Now these crabs are omnivores, so they'll eat pretty much anything. In the wild they eat seagrass and algae, but they will also scavenge dead animals and also hunt live prey. In fact, I've seen mine hunt down snails and even small crabs. They're very opportunistic feeders, so they'll basically eat whatever they can catch. And in the aquarium, of course, we can feed them pretty much anything. Mine loves frozen food, so I tend to feed him chopped up squid, mussels, prawn, stuff like that. But they will also happily munch on vegetables and algae, and even fish flakes. Really? It's like feeding a toddler. You can give them pretty much anything and they'll happily eat it. You probably already know that these guys are toxic. And yes, it's true. These crabs are venomous. They can inject a toxin into you with their sting. However, it's generally not fatal unless you are a mouse. Now, in the aquarium world, I've never heard of anyone being stung by one of these. However, they do have a reputation in the pet industry as being aggressive and grumpy crabs. And they do have a reputation of stinging people who handle them too much, but it doesn't really happen. But I have to admit, sometimes he does give me a little nip when I am cleaning his tank or something like that, but it's never really been a problem. If you want to handle them, just make sure you get them used to it from a young age. But if you buy them as adults, just expect that they're going to be a little bit nippy. The way that they sting is through these little pointy bits on their legs and their shell. They can flick them out and they can kind of catch you off guard. If they feel threatened, they'll use these to jab and flick out. And yes, it does hurt. It feels like a bee sting. However, these guys are also really clumsy. They have really big claws and they kind of swing them everywhere. So they often end up hurting themselves and getting stuck. Like maybe they're trying to grab something and they kind of knock themselves out. They're very, very clumsy. Another interesting thing about these guys is that they are nocturnal. You'll hardly ever see them during the day, but as soon as the lights go out, you'll see them come out and start exploring. They're very curious and like investigating everything. And finally, let's talk about breeding. Unfortunately, we don't know too much about these guys, but what we do know is that they do breed in the aquarium. In fact, I've seen my guy mating before. It's quite a strange sight. Usually the male is much smaller than the female, and the male kind of dances around the female and tries to get her to accept his mating, and then they kind of roll around together, and then the male fertilizes the eggs on the female's abdomen. She carries the eggs until they hatch, and then after a few weeks, the babies will be ready to mate. So yes, they do breed in the aquarium, but it is quite difficult. So if you're planning on breeding them, I would definitely do a lot of research. One more thing I want to mention about these crabs is that they do need iodine in their diet. Otherwise, they can suffer from a condition called iodine deficiency disease. Symptoms include loss of appetite, lethargy, loss of color, and eventually death. The best way to prevent this is to make sure you're feeding them a varied diet, including lots of fresh seafood. Anyway, that's all I wanted to cover about these guys. They're really fascinating creatures, and they have loads of weird behaviors and quirks. I could talk about them all day, but hopefully this gave you a brief overview of these guys. And remember, if you want to learn more about any of the animals that I feature on this channel, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Thanks for watching.